Hello students, welcome to another module of Refine Your English. And today you are going to learn the various tenses that we use in the English language. I am your instructor, Viju Kurian, the Department of English, Baselius College, Kottayam. Let's dive right into the topic. So what is tense? Now we know that every sentence contains a verb, and verb usually denotes action, and tense is a function of the verb, and tense of the verb shows time in which this action, which means the action that the verb does, takes place. So it shows the time in which the action took place. For example, look at that figure. Jan is walking. So if that person is walking when I am speaking, we can use the present continuous tense to indicate that the action of walking is happening when I am speaking of it. So that is one indication of a tense, which means that every sentence contains a verb. A verb usually shows action, and tense of the verb shows the time in which this action took place. So when we think about time, we know that there are three kinds of time. The time that we live, that is in the present. The time that has gone past, that is the past. And the time that is yet to happen, that is the future. The past, present and future. For example, you might be listening to this class in a classroom. That is the present time. What were you doing yesterday at this time? That happened in the past. And what will you be doing tomorrow at this time? That indicates the future. So three different kinds of time, and each of these times has four different forms. Why? This is to show the various relationships of time in which the action takes place. There are four forms for each of these tense. The simple forms shows that it talks about an action at a time. It does not specify any time, just a time. And the continuous, or otherwise known as progressive tense, talks about what is happening right now. The perfect form talks about one time in relation to another time. And the last one, perfect continuous, which is a mixture of the second and the third, shows a duration of action in relation to another time. Now these are general uses. The actual use are very varied. For example, the simple tense can be used to show something that happened right now, something that happened in the past, that is going to happen in the future. So the various uses are a lot. These are general uses of these tenses. Now we have 3 times and 4 forms for each. So that makes it 12 different tenses in English language. Now how do you distinguish between these different forms? In order to understand that, think that you are standing presently in now. So we are talking about everything in relation to now, the moment of speaking. So you look at the verb and then try to ask this question: when is this action happening? The action that is described in the verb, when is it happening? In relation to now. Now means when you utter this sentence, the verb in that sentence, when is it happening in relation to the moment of speaking. So if it has no specific time, it could be simply any time now. So that would be, you will be using the simple tense. What if the action is happening right now? Like I am speaking now and the action is also happening right now. So you can use the progressive or the continuous tense. What about the perfect tense? It is used with no specific time, but it started and ended before now. So we are talking about a time that has ended. Now it has ended. which means that at the moment of speaking the action has already ended. So that is called as perfect. Finally, perfect progressive, it started earlier and it is continuing right now. But we are only talking about the general use cases of these tenses. When you actually use them in sentences, all of these tenses have different purposes. You will be using them in different contexts to talk about the past, the present and the future. So when you use simple tense, you are talking about an action at a point in time, but you are not specifying what exact time it is. You can usually talk about habits using the simple tense. If you want to specify the time in which the action happens, you usually use the progressive tense. And when you use the perfect tense, you are talking about an action in reference to two times, which means that, look at the sentence, he has walked home, which means that at the moment of speaking he has already reached home. And perfect progressive, you are talking about an action started at one time and continuing another time also. He has been walking home. So these are the various use cases of these tenses, general use cases. Now you can see that the form of the verb changes according to the tense that is used, and some forms are regular. Regular means you can identify these are the verb forms, but sometimes they are irregular. It does not look like the verb at all. So let us look at them. The present form of the word, for example the word walk, and the plural is here walk is plural, which means that the plural, when you have a plural subject you use walk. When you have a singular subject you use walks. The past form is only one, walked. The present participle form which you use for continuous tenses is walking. The past participle form which you usually use for perfect tenses is walked. Now there are some irregular verbs, which means that they may not look like the original verb. For example, go and went. They don't look at all similar. That is why they are called irregular verbs. Know, knew. Different from regular verbs. So these are some of the changes that happens in the verb when you use it in a tense form. So when the tense is applied, the verb form changes. Now let us look at the very first tense, the present tense. Now the present tense also has four kinds: the simple present tense, the present progressive tense, the present perfect tense, the present perfect progressive tense. As I said earlier, the simple tense specifies no time. It usually used for habitual actions. The present progressive tense is used to specify for something that is happening at this moment. The present perfect tense, it started in the past, ended recently, but its impact is in the present. That is why it is still used as a present tense. Remember that present tense talks about present actions, but in the present perfect tense the action has already happened, but we are not talking about the action per se, we are talking about its impact in the present. The present perfect progressive tense, it started in the past and it continues now. Now how do you use them in sentences? How does the verb look like when you apply them in sentences? So when you are using simple present tense, you use the singular or plural form of the verb, and in progressive tense you use the present participle form of the verb. In the present perfect tense you use the has or have plus past participle form of the verb, And for present perfect progressive tense, you use has been or have been plus present participle form of the verb. So these are the ways in which the verb changes. This is how we use them in actual sentences. Now let us look at some examples of the present tense. The four present tenses. The simple present tense. She speaks English quite well, which means that is a skill that she has, and she presently possesses that skill. Present progressive tense is for the teacher is correcting papers, which means right now the teacher is correcting papers. Present perfect tense, the students have got their grades, which means that they already got their grades and presently they know their grades. Present perfect progressive tense is used for I have been taking medicine for the past few days, which means that you are still taking that medicine. You have been taking it for some time now and you are still taking it. Now let's move on to the next time, the next point in time, the past tense. Now again there are four past tenses. The simple past tense, which is used for something that recently finished. Next is the past progressive tense. Now just like present progressive tense or present continuous tense, the past progressive or the past continuous talks about a specific moment in the past. For example, what were you doing this time yesterday? Now that will give you a specific point in time in the past. So there you can use the past progressive tense. What about the past perfect tense? This is something that started sometime in the past but also ended in the past. So a duration of time, but both times are in the past, one happening before the other, but both in the past. The last one is the past perfect progressive tense, which started in the past, continued for some duration and ended in the past. So here you have to distinguish between the last two tenses, the past perfect tense and the past perfect progressive tense. The past perfect tense talks about one time in relationship with another time, but both in the past. In the last one, the past perfect progressive tense, you start in the past, continue for some duration, you end in the past. Now let's see how it is used in sentences. Here you can see how each of these tense forms are used in sentences. The simple past tense, you simply use the past tense form of the verb. Now remember that always the verb changes to indicate which of the tense forms are used. Remember that a tense is a function of the verb. Tense shows the time in which the action which is indicated by the verb takes place, and we see how the verb changes according to each of the tenses. The past progressive tense use was or were depending on the subject, whether it is singular or plural, and represents present participle form of the verb, the ing form. In the past perfect tense, you use had plus the past participle form of the verb. Usually, for example, the word take, it is taken, drive, driven. But for some words like put, the past participle form is that itself, put. The last one, past perfect progressive tense, which we have to use had been plus the present participle, the ing form of the verb. Let's look at some examples. The teacher corrected all the papers. We are not specifying at which time the action took place, but she has already completed the correction. So here we can use the simple past tense. The students were playing in the ground. When something was happening, the students were playing in the ground. So it specifies an action that was happening at that point of time. Past perfect tense, he had worked as a banker in Noida, which means that he is no longer working there, at least not in Noida. The past perfect progressive tense, he had been addicted to alcohol until he got a job. So he started his alcohol addiction, which continued for some time, and it stopped when he got a job. So here we can see the various uses of past tenses in various situations, and you can look at the examples and try to frame examples of your own. Now let us look at the future tense. You can see there are 4 future tenses. Simple future tense, which indicates a future event, to predict a future event or willingness to do something in the future. The future progressive tense, at this moment in the future. Again, remember that the progressive tense are used to specify a time. Here, in the case of future, a time in the future. The future perfect tense, an action which will be completed in the future by a certain time. The future perfect progressive tense is for ongoing action completed by a certain time in the future. So if you look at all the 4 kinds of tenses in each of the 3 times, you can see that there is a continuity, there is a commonality between all the 3 forms, all the 3 times in all the 4 forms. So you can learn them together. Now let us look how we use them in sentences. For the simple future tense, we use shall or will plus the present tense form of the verb. In the future progressive or the future continuous tense, we use shall be or will be plus present participle, again the ing form of the verb. In the future perfect tense, we use shall have or will have plus past participle form of the verb. The future perfect progressive tense, use shall have been or will have been plus present participle form of the verb. So always the tense is indicated by the change in the verb form. The verb will change according to the tense that is used. That is the way to determine what is the tense that is used. That is also the way we can apply the correct tense in a sentence. Let's look at some examples for each of these 4 tenses. There are, I can see, for future tenses, simple future tense is, you can see the example, the teacher will correct all assignments. Has the teacher corrected the assignments? No. But he or she will correct it in the future. But no specific time is mentioned. The future progressive tense, the students will be playing in the ground, which means that at that point in time, for example, tomorrow at 4 o'clock, the students will be playing in the ground. Future perfect tense, she will have completed 2 courses by December. Future perfect progressive tense, he will have been swimming for 3 hours, which means that he has started swimming, he will be swimming for some time, and he will be completing it at 3 hours in certain point of time, all in the future. Now let's see the various uses of simple present tense. I have briefly outlined the general use of a tense, but each of these tenses have several functions. They can be used in several contexts to indicate several times. That is why tenses are so complicated. But if you learn them properly, you can understand which tense to use at which context in what proper format. Let's now look at how the simple present tense is used in various contexts. The simple present tense is used to describe an action in present that does not specify any specific time. That we have already looked at. We live in Texas. It is used to describe a habitual action, something that you do every day. He goes to school. Describe a universal event. The sun rises in the east. Historical present in fiction and newspapers. Prime Minister calls for a meeting of all ministers. Now, what do you mean by historical present? It means that this happened already in the past. But when newspapers write it, they write it in the present tense, the simple present tense, to make it feel very vivid, to make it more dramatic. So they'll say the Prime Minister calls for a meeting of all ministers, but he has already called it. But in the newspaper, it comes as if he is calling it now. This is for dramatic effect. How do you use the present progressive tense? What are the different uses of the present progressive tense? The first use, obviously, to describe an action that happening right now. I am drinking tea. This is happening right now. But it's also used to describe a temporary situation. I am living in Texas, which means that currently I am living in Texas. That does not mean that is my permanent home. Now, if you look at the previous example, for example, let's go back to the previous slides and look at the second example. The first example, you can see we live in Texas. Here it means it's a permanent situation. That is our permanent house. But if you come to the present progressive tense and you say I am living in Texas, which means that for a temporary time, for some time I am living in Texas, but this is not my permanent home. To describe a temporary habit, he is smoking a lot these days. For a definite future plan, I am meeting the principal tomorrow. Now look at here, you use the present tense to even specify a future action. The present perfect tense can be used to describe an action completed at an unspecified time before. I have returned home. Here you are not specifying at what time you have returned, but it shows that you have returned home and now you are at home. To describe an experience, I have been to France. So I know about France. I have an experience of being to France. Describe a change over time. He has become smarter over the years. An action you expect to be completed. The rain hasn't stopped, which means that it is still raining right now. The present perfect progressive tense. It is used to describe an action from the past continuing till now. I have been talking to you for 1 hour. Suppose you call a friend and you keep on talking, then you realize that it's already 1 hour since you started talking. So you tell your friend that I have been talking to you for 1 hour, which means that you're still continuing that action and it started in the 1 hour ago. With recently, or with these two words, recently or lately, you can use the present perfect progressive tense. I have been feeling very tired recently. Now let's move on to the various uses of past tense. Now it is used to describe an action completed in the past. I booked a cab. It is used for duration in the past. I lived in Texas for 2 years. To describe an habit in the past. I studied Spanish when I was younger. Past generalizations. People paid much more to make cell phone calls in the past. Generalization is when you talk generally about things, not specifying anything. So as I said earlier, each tense form has a common use, but it is also used for other functions. Sometimes a present tense can be used to indicate a future event. A present can be used to specify an event that is already happened. So the tense forms are complex because their functions varies according to context. How do you use the past progressive tense? To describe an interrupted action in the past which happened. Interrupted action means something that stopped in between. I was cooking a meal when she called, which means that you have not finished cooking the meal and you are cooking a meal when the other thing happened. Parallel action. I was reading a and she was typing it out. So two actions happen simultaneously. That is called parallel action. Repetition in the past. He was always coming late to the class. So that shows a repetitive action. A specific time in the past. At 6 p.m. yesterday, Rohit was walking in the garden. Again, when you use progressive tense, whether it is future, present or past, one of the major uses is to denote a specific time. Now, when do you use a past perfect tense? It is used to describe an action completed in the past before something happens. I had booked a cab before he came in the car. So usually two things happen and one thing happened before the other thing. Both happen in the past, but one is past in the past, an earlier action. Another use is to specify duration before something in the past. I had lived in Texas for 2 years before moving to England. So 2 years I was in Texas. The duration is important here. But now no more in Texas. Now it is he or she is in England. Let's now move on to the last of the past tense, the past perfect progressive tense. Where do you use it? It is used to describe an action that happens before something in the past. They had been talking for over an hour before Tony arrived. So a duration of action, then another action. So two actions, both in the past. Then a cause of something in the past. She had been falling sick because of overwork. Now these two uses are specific to the past perfect progressive or the past perfect continuous tense. So these are the various uses of the past tense. Now let's move on to the future tense. Starting with the simple future. The simple future tense show voluntary action and promise. For example, I will send you the book once I get it. You can also use it to predict something. 2030 will be a great year. This is just a prediction. So in these two use cases, you can use the simple future tense. Moving on, the use cases of future progressive tenses are two. One, to specify an interrupted action in the future. The children will be watching TV when the parents come at night. So two actions where one action is happening in the future at a specific point when another action happens, when that action is interrupted by another action. Or to specify a time in the future. I'll be working on a book tomorrow at this hour. So you know that continuous tenses or progressive tenses are always used to specify a particular time, whether it is past, present or future. So that is a use case for future progressive tense. Moving on, in the future perfect, we use it for completed action before some time in the future. By next November, I will have received my promotion. Duration before something in the future. By November this year, the theatres will have shut for 7 months. When you use these tenses, please remember how to use them properly. As in, what is the proper grammatical format in which you use each tense. Each verb has a different tense form in all the 12 cases. So make sure you remember what are the appropriate tenses, what are the appropriate verb forms that you have to use when you make the tense forms. Now the last tense, the 12th tense, the future perfect progressive tense. Now let's look at the last of the 12 tenses, the future perfect progressive tense. It is used to specify duration before something happens in the future. They'll have been talking for over an hour. That specifies the duration by the time Thomas arrives. Cause of something in the future. Claudia's English will be perfect when she returns to Germany because she is going to have been studying English in the United States for over 2 years. This sentence can be confusing because there are more than one tense at work here. Will be perfect will be is a simple future tense. When she returns, that can be termed as a simple present tense, and the third portion, she is going to have been studying English, that is a future progressive, perfect progressive tense. So all of this, the entire sentence is not in future perfect progressive, but a portion of the sentence, the second portion of the sentence specifies the future perfect progressive tense. She is going to have been studying English. So these are the various use cases of the 12 tenses that we have studied in the English language. Now, in order to make it more thorough, please try to make sentences of your own in each of the 12 tenses. Also ensure that you follow the proper format, the correct verb structure, the correct sentence structure when you create sentences, so that it is correctly fit to the format that is given for each tense. Now let's have a quick summary of what we have learned today. We started with how every sentence has a verb, and verb usually shows action or a condition, and tense is a reference of the verb. It's a function of the verb which shows the time in which the action of the verb takes place. Now there are 3 periods of time that we all know: the present, the past and the future. These are the directions of time, and each of these 3 tenses have 4 different forms: the simple, the progressive, the perfect progressive. In these 4, the simple tense form and the perfect tense form, they don't specify an exact time of action. They just show that the action happened in that particular time, whether it is present, past or future. In the progressive tense form and the perfect progressive tense form, it specifies the time of action or duration. It does not specify, it does specify the time of action, the time in which this action took place, an exact time. Now these are general use cases of these tenses. The specific use cases have been discussed in the previous slides. So in order to make it thorough, as I said earlier, please try to make sentences of your own and make it appropriately, like use the proper grammatical structure of each of the 12 tenses, and by repetition you can practice and make it perfect. I hope you had an interesting session. Tenses are complicated, but if you practice them enough, it will be very easy for you. Thank you.